This is Authentic. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Authentic Media's first author debrief. I'm joined today by retired Navy Captain Kevin Hozer Miller, A-7 and F-18 pilot, author of The Silver Waterfall, which we'll be discussing today. Hi, Kevin. How are you?
Hey, Scott. Great to be with you.
Oh, I appreciate you being here. Kevin Miller has a long list of accomplishments, which you can find at his website, www.kevinmillerauthor.com. As I said, he's a retired attack and fighter pilot, as well as the author of the Raven 1 series of books. But today we're talking about his first foray into historical fiction with The Silver Waterfall, a novel of the Battle of Midway. And I'll just say, as a rated naval historian through the Army Staff College, I know quite a bit about the battle, but I think Kevin is a recognized expert on this pivotal moment in world and particularly U.S. Navy and naval aviation history. So I am really excited to learn a lot about the battle and about the process of writing historical fiction in general and the Silver Waterfall in particular. So without further ado, Kevin, let's get everyone oriented to the map, as you will. When we went into planning sessions, we had to orient ourselves. Let's talk about the Battle of Midway itself and the background to the battle, because what I found reading the book, The Silver Waterfall, is that it is an immensely entertaining book, and it is very well written, in my humble opinion. It is a terrific story on its own, but it takes on a whole nother level of richness when you really put it in the context of the first year of the war in the Pacific. So if you will, Kevin, let's do a quick thumbnail of the Pacific War that, of course, started with Pearl Harbor and the key events that brought us to June 1942.
Sure, Scott. Yes, early 1942, pretty dark time. I mean, the battle line is essentially at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. We do have our aircraft carriers survive that attack, but the Japanese are on the march throughout the Western Pacific. They have taken the Philippines, they've taken Singapore, they have sunk any Royal Navy ships that have ventured out on the high seas. They attacked the Australian base at Darwin to neutralize any Australian threat there. Took Kido Butai into the Indian Ocean, where they sank the Royal Navy carrier Hermes and attacked their port at Trincomalee. They were also able to take Rabaul near the Solomons. So the Japanese now have uncontested command of the Western Pacific and Eastern Indian Oceans. Now, what we are doing, though, we're not just wringing our hands. I mean, as early as early February 1942, Nimitz and Halsey have taken our carriers into the central Pacific Islands and are attacking Japanese outposts. And these raids are kind of ignored by the Japanese, not really causing them too much trouble. But through our code-breaking efforts, which through superior Japanese OPSEC, we did not know what they were planning on December 7th, but we got wind because we stayed with it that they were going to move into the Coral Sea. They wanted to take Port Moresby in New Guinea and then cut off the sea lines communication to Australia. So Halsey through Nimitz was able to position himself in the Coral Sea. Under the command of Frank Jack Fletcher, who we'll talk about later. And this famous naval battle, the first in history where the combatants did not see each other, was really fought to a draw. We lost USS Lexington. We lost an oiler. The Japanese lost a light carrier and had one carrier damaged, Shokaku, and Zoikaku lost most of her air wing. So both task forces withdrew. Australia remained free. And I forgot to mention that in April of 1942, the Doolittle raid just shocked the Japanese. That the emperor was in danger, as 16 medium bombers taking off from a carrier just probably still believe it remains the most amazing, most daring airborne raid in history. So the Japanese, even the Army, realized, okay, we have to keep resources back here in Japan to defend from future attacks. And then we can't go into Australia like we thought we wanted to do because these pesky American carriers. So now everyone in Tokyo agrees that these carriers have got to be put on the bottom. And they all turn to Admiral Yamamoto, how are we going to do this? And then he had been thinking about this, of course, since he heard on December 8th that the carriers had escaped. So he devised a plan to take something from the Americans that they would defend. And he decided on Midway, which is 1,100 miles from Pearl Harbor. Surely the Americans would come out and defend that. And when he did, he'd be ready to take them under his big guns. While he was at it, while the Americans were busy elsewhere, because again, he wanted the Americans to attack him at Midway, and he would win that battle. They would send a carrier striking force and an amphibious invasion force to the Aleutian Islands and get a couple of outposts that they felt would secure their northern flank. And they felt that they had and a case can be made that they did have the superior naval power to do all of that. We can talk about how that worked out for them, but that was the plan in May of 1942.
So a couple things for the listener who may not know. The Kido Butai was the Japanese carrier striking force, and it was a very novel concept at this point. In my reading, I would consider it tactically probably more astutely organized and used than U.S. naval aviation, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that.
I do not disagree.
Okay. And its composition for Pearl Harbor, of course, was 6 carriers: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, the Soryu, the Shokaku, and the Zoikaku. And as you said, the Shokaku and Zoikaku essentially became non-mission capable as a result of the Battle of the Coral Sea. So that had an incredible effect on the outcome of the Battle of Midway. So that's one thing. The other would be, you mentioned Yamamoto wanted to bring the U.S. fleet under his big guns. And I think that's really important because we were reduced to these, some call them pinprick raids by Halsey's carrier force in early 1942 because we were deprived of our battleships at Pearl Harbor. But there was still a widely held belief throughout the world that the battleship was still the premier naval weapon. And even the Japanese felt, well, these carriers, they're good for scouting, they're good for reconnaissance. We can attack Midway with them. We can whittle down the American carrier fleet, but I'm really going to bring them under the big guns. And that was really at the core of his plan, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And I believe there was an element of ego in this. Yamamoto had been at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where Admiral Togo took the Russian fleet under his guns. And the Russian fleet, the Russian Navy, was the 3rd largest Navy in the world at the time. I mean, a serious naval force that the Japanese just annihilated in that strait. So Yamamoto, who was a midshipman, who was wounded in the battle, he saw himself as a modern-day Togo. And his carrier planes were going to beat up Midway. The next day, the amphibian force would land. Now the Japanese have Midway. The Americans would come out, and Yamamoto and 11 battleships, including the supergiant Yamato that he was riding, would have their way with him. And that was he wanted those style points of winning the battle that way.
And as we discussed, that's not quite how it worked out, because as you said, the efforts of the U.S. codebreakers let us know that Midway was in fact the target, and Admiral Nimitz rolled the dice, if you will, in a couple different ways. We had 3 carriers available, correct? And I believe 5 total in the fleet at that time, including one that was in the Atlantic. You can correct me on that.
Saratoga had been torpedoed earlier in the war, and she was running hard from the West Coast toward the battle, and she got there, the day after it was all over. But Yeah, so we had three. Saratoga is a couple of days away.
Right, including one of the three being Yorktown, who was repaired in a Herculean effort at Pearl Harbor in a matter of days following the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and her return. And Halsey rolls the dice in sending this carrier force out to essentially ambush the Japanese. And he rolls the dice because at this pivotal moment in history, Admiral Halsey, who is rightfully seen in history as one of the greats of U.S. naval carrier aviation leadership, is struck down by a tropical disease, as the historical records show. And I've heard everything from shingles to beriberi, but he's out of the battle at this point. So the question is, who do you give America's last best hope in the Pacific to?
It's and so actually the senior commander at Midway was Frank Jack Fletcher,
Mm-hmm.
who had been at Coral Sea aboard Yorktown.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, as you mentioned, Admiral Halsey, through the stress of combat those many months, and so he's down with this skin condition, and so he felt that his cruiser commander, Admiral Raymond Spruance, would be the right guy, not just
Mm-hmm.
the next guy, but the right guy
Right.
to lead Task Force 16, two carriers which are Enterprise that had some combat experience, and brand new Hornet that had delivered the Doolittle Raiders. She had been in commission, only a matter of months, really. A green ship.
Right. So basically uncombat tested, and perhaps some effect on later events. So the course of the battle in a thumbnail sketch is the Japanese attempt to execute their plan, which with most Japanese plans was high artistry. It's much like kabuki, much like a no play, very intricate, very beautiful to behold, but it all has to be timed exactly right, and everything has to go exactly according to plan for it to come off. And it didn't. Why don't you tell us about exactly why that happened?
Our code breakers, I want to name them.
Mm-hmm.
Commander Roquefort
Mm-hmm.
and Commander Layton, Joseph Roquefort, Edwin Layton, had worked together. And Roquefort is pushing his guys, and they're just drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes and not getting much sun. I mean, they're working 24/7 down there. But they had broken most of the Japanese code, and they brought this information to Admiral Nimitz. Look, they're going to attack Midway, and they're going to do it on June 4th, and this is what they're bringing. And so this information is relayed to Washington, and Washington didn't believe it. It's typical. No, you guys are wrong. And the feeling there was they're going to go to Johnston Island. Nimitz believed his team at SINCPAC headquarters. So they said, why don't we do this? Let's have Midway send a message in the clear. The water desalinization plant is on the fritz, or words to that effect. And so they said, all right, they did it. And so the Japanese picked this up, and they were able to break the code that, okay, Midway's water desalinization plant is not working, so we need to bring extra water. And so this wasn't to find out if the Japanese were going to Midway. Nimitz and his team knew they were going to Midway. This was to prove to Washington that they were. And we can talk later how that affected Joseph Roquefort's career, that slight that had been administered to Washington. So we knew they were coming, and we knew what they were bringing. A great story that in Edwin Layton's memoirs, about a week before the battle, Nimitz wanted him to be Yamamoto's alter ego. And so he said in a briefing, okay, Admiral Yamamoto, where are you guys going to be? And he says, well, sir, I think, it's, northwest of the island on June 4th. No. I want to know exactly where you're going to be. You're the alter ego. So Layton says, I guess he kind of stands at attention and swallows and said, sir, I believe at 06 in the morning on June 4th, we'll find the Japanese from Midway, 175 miles at 320 degrees. And Layton said he didn't sleep for the next week. So we knew they were there, and like you mentioned, Yorktown, limps back to Pearl Harbor. Nimitz inspects the ship, and the dockmaster says, "Sir, we need 3 months." And he says, "Gentlemen, you got 3 days." And they turned to and they put her to sea in 3 days and patched her up. She could not make full power, but she's seaworthy, and off she goes to join Enterprise and Hornet. So Admiral Fletcher is in overall command, and they go to a place called Point Luck, which is their planned ambush point to the northeast of Midway. And again, they know the Japanese are going to come down from the northwest, and so they would catch them on their flank. So we had our PBYs patrolling, and we had fortified Midway with Army bombers and everything that we could send it. Navy, Marine Corps, and Army, probably one of the first really joint operations. But PBYs found the Japanese first on June 3rd, the amphibious force about 700 miles to the southwest of Midway, and a PBY flown by Ensign Reed had found them and radioed it back. The next morning, though, a PBY flown by Lieutenant Howard 80 to the northwest of Midway, found the Japanese and radioed it back. When they got the report of Makalapa Hill, Nimitz turned to Leighton and said, "Leighton, you were 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes off." Mm-hmm. And I still believe that's our greatest intelligence success.
I would take that anytime.
Yes.
Absolutely. So the stage is set. The Japanese, Admiral Nagumo, who's in charge of the Kido Butai and the strike on Midway Island to soften it up, if you will, and lure the American carriers out, which in the Japanese plan are going to still be at Pearl Harbor and then have to sortie out and run over a Japanese picket line of submarines and be whittled down and, then be ambushed by the Kido Butai, who's now put paid to Midway, and that will be done. And it doesn't quite work out that way.
No.
Yeah.
The Japanese, just like they had on December 7th, they launched a raid of 100 aircraft from 4 aircraft carriers, and with just amazing precision. It's impressive. We're able to attack Midway, but Midway was ready for them. Our Marine defenders, took to the skies. Everything that could fly at Midway that got airborne before the Japanese got there, and the Marine gunners on Eastern and Sand Islands took a heavy toll of the Japanese. Although the Japanese did get through and beat up both islands pretty bad, but they were still operational. And the strike leader, Lieutenant Tominaga, he could see this from the cockpit of his aircraft, so he radioed back, there's a need for a second strike. Now, the second strike was never in the plan. But now we got to go back.
Right.
And,
the second strike was going to be armed up to take on the American carriers when they showed up.
Well, yes. So, they had this as a precaution. All right, well, if there are any American carriers, and there won't be, but if there are, we should have some airplanes in the hangar bay that are loaded, but, they're just going to sit there all day and do nothing. So the word comes back, hey, we need to come back here. There's more work to do. And that was a surprise. So, okay, the amphibious in landing is tomorrow. It's got to go. So look, we got airplanes aboard. Let's drop the anti-ship weapons. Let's put on the general purpose land weapons. And let's do that now as a Tominaga group is flying back here, and we can recover them and then launch. And it's going to work great.
And I would imagine playing into this is in the back of Nagumo's mind, the criticism he had already received for the Pearl Harbor raid and not launching a third wave, which arguably could have been much more devastating, as well as the fact that while they've attacked Midway and they've done a significant amount of damage, as you've said, there are a series of uncoordinated attacks from the land-based aircraft, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps coming from Midway, and their very uncoordination just continues to press home to the Japanese the fact that Midway is not neutralized.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was heavily stovepiped in those days, and the Navy is not going to talk to the Marine Corps. No one's going to talk to the Army. But so on their own program, everyone just got airborne and headed to the northwest. And But you make a good point that it was over a period of almost an hour. These formations would show up. The Japanese would shoot them down, and then another one would show up. The one that the Japanese feared the most was the B-17s, bombing from very high altitude, and you're not going to hit anything unless it's just luck. But the Japanese had to honor that threat, and the B-17 bristling with guns. I mean, even the Zeros didn't really want to mess with them. But over 50 airplanes attacked the Japanese from Midway, and there's nothing to show for it. And half of them are shot down. Those that survive are shot up, and they're not going to come back that afternoon.
Right. Meanwhile, Fletcher and Spruance at their ambush Point Luck to the northeast have the PBY reports, but Yorktown, I believe, has sent out scouting planes, and may be important to point out at this point that the composition of the U.S. Air Wing at the time is a fighter squadron, a torpedo squadron, and 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntlesses pictured on the cover of the Silver Waterfall, but one is a scouting squadron and one is a bombing squadron. And something I thought that was brought out very adroitly in your book was the difference in those. Same plane, same Navy pilots, but a different thought process. I knew it, but I really felt it brought to life in the book, and I think it's important because now you've got a decision. I've launched half of my dive bomber striking force, I believe, in the case of Yorktown. What do I do now? Do I recover them? Do I send a weaker strike? And what does Spruance do on when TF-16 with Enterprise and Hornet?
Yes. Admiral Fletcher was disobedient that morning. He couldn't take it. He was afraid that the Japanese were gonna, what if they go around us and go to Hawaii? So he at dawn he launches his scouts to search north of him, and Nimitz told him not to do that for 2 reasons. He says, look, they're gonna be there at 0600 in the morning, so be ready and launch and hit them. But I don't want them to be found by a carrier airplane. I want to only show my patrol airplanes from Midway. Mm-hmm. They're going to expect those. If they see one of your little gray carrier planes, they're gonna be tipped off that we're here.
Right.
Fletcher launched anyway. That means that when he recovered those airplanes, about the time that the word came in where the Japanese were, they're all heading east into the light winds to recover, and that's away from the Japanese, which increases the distance to the Japanese, and that's going to be a real problem for the torpedo aircraft and the fighter aircraft, and this is going to make it harder for the SBDs that had longer legs, but not that long. So that is what was going on then. But Spruance, gets this information, and in Enterprise, he turns to Miles Browning and says, launch everything you have at the earliest opportunity. Now, and so they did, obviously, but there's kind of a method to this. There's okay, we're going to launch the fighters first, because they need just a smaller amount of deck than the SBDs. We'll launch the scouts next with 500-pound bombs, the bombing squadron with 1,000-pounders last, and then once everyone's airborne, we're going to bring up the TBDs from the hangar bay, and they're going to use the whole flight deck to get airborne in those weak engines with those 2,000-pound torpedoes. Now, all of this takes time. So after almost an hour of this, the torpedo planes on Enterprise were nowhere near being ready. And Spruance just signaled to his dive bombers, just go. And the fighter guys, they were off on their own. Meanwhile, over on Hornet actually did this. Hornet got all these airplanes airborne. Now they're holding overhead the ship for almost an hour, chewing up gas. Finally got the torpedo airplanes off, and there's a picture of a VT-8, heading out to do battle, and a high in the clouds. You can see little specks of Ring's dive bombers as they're all heading in the same direction. So Hornet, with 59 airplanes, the only carrier that was able to do what they all thought they could do.
maybe a good point to digress just a little bit about the Kido Butai and that tactical procedures they had, or TTPs, where if you just looked at it on paper, the way the Americans were fighting the battle and the way the Japanese were fighting the battle, yet again stacked towards the Japanese process, because I have read it elsewhere, and I think you put it in the book that the Japanese launched their entire strike in less time than it took one of our carriers to launch their dive bombers.
Yes,
if I recall correctly.
The Japanese pilots would just take interval on each other. So the first one go and the second one behind would kind of taxi in position, and then just go and go and go. Whereas the Americans, you taxi up there and then they run to full power, and the launch officer, maybe what we call today's catapult officer, and there were no catapults; it was all deck run. They would listen to the engine, and okay, does it sound right? Maybe okay, idle. Let's try this again. Try another run up. And this is all going to take time. If every airplane is going to have 30, 45 seconds, a minute or more, whereas the Japanese are getting airborne in 10-second intervals.
And additionally, they would sequence the strike such that the carriers were paired together, right? Akagi and Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu, and at Pearl Harbor, Shokaku and Zuakaku. Within the pairs, one would launch dive bombers and one would launch torpedo bombers, or attack planes, as the Japanese would call them. So, instead of trying to get all these disparate types, the Zeros would go off, the fighters would go off with that short deck run, and notably, the Japanese had a different philosophy on how much would stay behind for CAP, or combat air patrol, and how many would escort, but they would launch this in a matter of minutes. So it would seem the odds are stacked in their favor. But as you said, as I mentioned before, there's Japanese artistry, right? And I think much of Japanese culture can be characterized with artistry. If there is a singular American culture, since we're a melting pot, get her done is the modern phrase. I don't think they would have used it then, but send the dive bombers, go, don't wait.
Yes, you're right. I mean, our culture is to be flexible and to take initiative. And if the situation calls for let's break convention, we got to break it. So go. Why did the Japanese not have at least one of their two Coral Sea carriers at Midway? Well, two reasons. You can't take an air group from one ship and put it on another. That's just not. Now we would do that all day long. We wouldn't think twice about it. And the other one was, but we don't even need to send all that force. We're going to be fine. I mean, because we know this is going to be a rout. So we don't even need them. And boy, they sure did.
And probably worth mentioning there that while Spruance is generally lauded for his decisions, and Fletcher is either not criticized or maybe somewhat criticized for his actions at the battle. For example, you said the Northern Scouting Line. They both defied convention, and the fact of the matter is that if the strikes don't go off the way they had, then Spruance has probably not made the right decision in history's eye. And if the Japanese had been sliding around to the north, then Fletcher's the genius, right? Who said, well, I know what I was told, but I found him, didn't I? And I saved the day. So it's point luck indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fletcher made another decision that morning as far as when the Yorktown SBDs were going to go and attack the Japanese. And this is about 9 o'clock in the morning now. And, so Spruance, his two carriers have been airborne now for over an hour. Fletcher finally gets his deck ready, and he can launch his two SBD squadrons and his fighter squadron, and of course his torpedo squadron. So they all go to the Japanese, in a coordinated manner. But what he did is unknown to Max Leslie, his bombing squadron commanding officer. He decided, I'm going to hold back my scouts. And so Leslie is airborne, heading toward the Japanese. Going, where are the scouts? I thought, we briefed together. Where are they? And that was a decision that was made. He was not aware. And if they were there, a very good case can be made that they would have, found Hiryu, which had been unmolested, and attacked her. The expectation from the Americans was that one SBD squadron would damage/sink one enemy carrier. So Enterprise with 2 squadrons. Okay, Commander McCluskey, your job is to sink, damage 2 carriers, and he did. Admiral Fletcher, okay, your job is to ambush the Japanese and attrite them, and so 4-1. I mean, that's a win, and but both those officers, history maligns them, and I think Fletcher more deservedly so than McCluskey, and but they did what they were supposed to do.
So the maligning of McCluskey, now is that for what is, depending on who you read and what you believe, either a considered decision to attack the closer carrier? We should probably talk about that doctrine, right? Which is the 2 squadrons are going to close in, and the squadron in the lead is going to attack the further carrier, and the squadron behind is going to attack the closer carrier. So they're all diving near simultaneously. And famously, Dick Best takes his squadron into a dive and is then passed by McCluskey's group, if I have that right, in the dive, and realizes, oh, we're all attacking the same carrier.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is human nature.
Right.
Well, first, how did all this happen?
Yeah, right. Let's step back there.
At 20,000 feet. I mean, it is. We never fly at 20,000 feet. It's freezing up here, and I got this oxygen mask that's not my personal mask. Today's aviators have their own personal mask, but it's just a mask that's in the airplane, and I got to put this thing on. It's hard and brittle. It doesn't fit, and Lieutenant J.G. Krager, who is Lieutenant Best's wingman, he signals to him, "Hey, I can't breathe on this thing. This thing isn't working." So Best, I'm sure, says, "Nah." And so he takes him down to 15,000 feet, and you can breathe it out of there. And so here's McCluskey up here at 20. Here's Best down here 5,000 feet. They're not signaling to each other, but they're kind of following. So McCluskey gets to the end of his leg, and all he can see is water and clouds. And so he decides to go another 15 minutes, and Nimitz called this one of the most important decisions of the war. Now, he told Admiral Spruance and Captain Murray back on Enterprise, okay, if they're not there, I'm going to turn northwest and go back up their track. So that's what he did after 15 minutes. They're still not there. So he turns northwest, and now it's getting on toward 10, and they've been airborne for well over 2 hours. I mean, they got airborne a little after 7, finally left the ship a little bit before 8, and the airplanes are about to run out of gas. Tail end Charlie, ensigns on my wing. So he just turns north. He's kind of edging back home, which is to the northeast, but just doing the best he can. All he can see is a blanket of clouds, but you get on top of a cloud, you kind of look down there between the breaks and see the surface. And he's got binoculars, he's looking through there, and he comes across a destroyer. And he thought it was a light cruiser. And but it's not an American. That's Japanese, and so he follows it, of course, and it brings him into the Kido Butai, and so now, as they're talking to each other on the radio now, and so Best is saying, okay, attack according to doctrine. I've got my carrier. I'm attacking according to doctrine, and McCluskey may have stepped on him, may have missed it. Some say he didn't. He was a fighter guy, didn't know. I don't believe that. I think he had experience in dive bombers. He knew what he was doing. But it gets stepped on. They miss it. So here are the enemy carriers, and this is what McCluskey sees. He sees left, right. Best sees near, far, and there's doctrine how to attack each. So both of them are in their minds are seeing. In their minds, different things. It's really the same thing, but they interpret it differently. So
perspective is always different, right?
Yes, they 30 airplanes roll in on Kaga, essentially, and so Best is just beginning his dive, and here comes McCluskey and the others that are above him at 20,000. I should back up a little bit. The doctrine was to come down to about 13 to 10,000 feet. So they all ramped down, but McCluskey, of course, is still high. And then they dive breaks open. They roll on their back, pull down, and they're in their dive. So Best sees this, and he says, "Okay, we're all going for this ship. There's one right over there that we got to go get." So he is able to take his wingmen, Krager and Weber, and pull out of their dive and retract their flaps and go over to Akagi, less than 10 miles away, and roll in on her.
Right. Which, without trying to get ahead, is the clutch moment in U.S. naval aviation, right? 3 planes, 3 bombs, the Japanese flagship.
Yes.
Yeah. And Best leads them down.
Kaga was attacked by roughly 30 airplanes and 5 hits.
Right.
From those 30.
Which we should say is not horrible, by the way.
Yeah. So here's Richard Best, who is a hero, and takes his 2 wingmen over to Akagi. And as you mentioned, there were 3 bombs dropped on Akagi. Shall we talk about the results of those 3 bombs now?
Let's.
Okay. The way that the pilots would operate the SBD is they would take trail on one another, and they would roll in for their own individual run. So they're coming down the chute, one behind the other. Maybe they're all set a little bit, but they're each going to track and drop their own bomb. So we can surmise, assume, expect that Lieutenant Richard Best, the commanding officer, is going to be the first one down. And the now at the same time, Commander Mitsuo Fushida is aboard the flag bridge or the bridge of Akagi, and and someone yells "Hell divers!" and I look up, and here come 3 plump SBDs falling on them. The first bomb, and this is according to Akagi's deck log, hits close aboard the port side paint scraper, big splash. The bridge is doused with water. Second bomb whistles in, hits amidships. Third bomb, hits off the port quarter, close aboard. But we've got 1 bomb hit.
Right.
Now, but what really happened? Yes, the first bomb, close aboard, splash. Second bomb hits amidships, and now it is starting to cook off airplanes in the 2 hangar bays, upper and lower hangar bays. And they are full of bombs. They're going to attack. They're full of anti-ship. There's torpedoes. There's fuel hoses, and there's bombs from our abortive land attack mission kind of pushed over to the side of the hangar bay. The third bomb hits close aboard Akagi's port side, and all evidence is that the concussion from that bomb jammed her rudder, and so she can no longer operate, even if she wasn't hit by the other 2 with a jammed rudder. She's not going to escape.
That's what doomed the Bismarck. That's what would have doomed Akagi without the other hit. And
yes,
if you've ever seen them, I say to the viewer, and obviously not to you, you know what I'm talking about. A ship undergoing shock trials for acceptance into the Navy. That close aboard hit is a big deal.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't. It is a miss. It is not an ineffective bomb drop. However, neither one of those misses. Obviously, not just the third with a rudder jam, but I can only imagine the damage to installed systems, to fire main, to anything else, just from that hit alone.
Yes, right? That's right. Shock testing.
Yes,
important. So, so Akagi now, and so Akagi has been hit. And airplanes are cooking off, and fires are quickly growing. At the same time, about 10 miles away, Yorktown guys come across Soryu, and on the way there, they had armed their weapons when this newfangled electrical firing switch. I mean, this is the SBD-3 model, which has this what we would consider space age technology, where you can drop a weapon by just a push button on the stick. Wow.
Right. And, instead of the manual lever they're doing otherwise. Right.
By your left ankle in the previous models. So Max Leslie and 2 of his 12th pilots lose their bombs as they arm them, and Leslie is just beside himself. I can't believe this is happening.
Right.
But he leads his guys in, and he's strafing all the way down, and so his one squadron scored 3 hits on Soryu, forward, midships, and aft, and again within minutes, Soryu is burning like a blowtorch from both ends. All during this time, there's torpedo planes down there, but we can talk about them later perhaps. But getting back to the Akagi attack, and this is there's controversies about Midway. Only Midway geeks can come up with controversies, but this is one of them. And who scored that decisive hit on Akagi, and so I think that the feeling is, well, it's Richard Best, the hero, and that afternoon, scored another hit on Hiryu, and it's Richard Best. But if you look at the evidence, it's the Decalogue evidence, it's Fushida's eyewitness account. Now, Fushida, as we know, wasn't always telling the truth.
Right. Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Certainly Akagi, but this is a credible truth, and
right.
And so Richard Best, Skipper Best, a hero, close aboard the port side, Lieutenant J.G. Bud Kroger, midships, Ensign Fred Weber, close aboard on the port quarter that jams the rudder. Mm-hmm. And Partial and Tully, who are heroes, and Shattered Sword, must reading.
Right. Yes.
Just absolutely the last word. But there's a graphic there, and they show the 3 airplanes in a formation like this, with Best in the middle. And so, if you're looking geographically, okay, that makes sense. Okay, here's, left, center, and right. But they came down individually in their own runs.
And as anyone who's been a leader, and I think especially for a naval officer, there's a feeling of, I'm going to go first. So it completely makes sense to me that Best is in that dive first.
It is unthinkable.
Right.
For a strike lead to, okay, well, you guys go ahead. I'll follow.
You go ahead. That's fine. Yeah.
It's
but the other thing is, he was the skipper. He made a decision on the spot with, pulling up and realizing, and he had trained these guys and he led these guys. So I think you and I are probably in complete agreement. Even if he did have a close aboard bomb, not a hit, he's no less a hero.
No less.
Right? I mean,
yes.
Without him, I think you can argue that Hiryu and Akagi are making the strike that afternoon.
You bet. Yeah. And Wade McCleskey missed. As did 24 other pilots on Kaga.
Right. If this were easy, anyone could do it. Right. I'll digress for a moment. There is a movie about Midway. There are several, but there's a latest one, and it's a little Hollywoodized. I'll just leave it there.
Very disappointing.
So quick sea story, home story. My wife decides to surprise me by taking me to see Midway. She tells me we're going to see something else. We go to see Midway, and I go a little bit of, all right, okay, but it's the thought that counts. It's very sweet, and we go, and I come out sort of with grinding my teeth a little bit, and sort of but my wife was like, I get it now. You've talked about this so much. She's like, man, there was a lot of luck involved, and that dive bombing thing is really tough. And what it drove home to me is, for those of us who don't study this for a living, there's different mediums that can illustrate to different people. Like,
you make a great point, and the movie provided a service to the public who are not Midway geeks. And,
right.
Hey, this happened, some 80 years ago. Wow.
Yeah, and what's the quote about Top Gun? It's not a documentary. Right.
Yes.
So as long as we keep that in mind, but
yes.
All of that being said, so we have the 3 carriers that are hit then, and we can go a couple different ways here. Let's go to those torpedo planes, and I'll start the American torpedo planes, and I'll start by saying, this huge dichotomy in my mind. So growing up, read my first military history book probably before I was even 10 on the Battle of Midway. And to me, between reading that and then reading European history, the Dauntless, the Stuka, the dive bomber is this weapon. And, you read about the Vals and the Japanese dive bomber, but that was what the Japanese felt was their big hammer. in the carrier air wing, and in fact, it wasn't their most effective weapon. It was their torpedo bomber. Whereas for the Americans, I think at Coral Sea there was some feeling that maybe this was still a coordinated attack with dive bombers and torpedo bombers together, which if it comes off works wonderfully. But at Midway, the torpedo bomber sort of becomes an awkward uncle in the room, almost, if you will.
If Halsey were there,
Mm-hmm.
the torpedo bombers would not have gone until the Dauntlesses had damaged the ships.
Okay.
He, throughout, early 1942, and in 1941, I'll say 1941, and when the fleet was still in California, this is a secret test in a lake they found in somewhere, and they sent the torpedo planes there, and all the torpedoes, they didn't find their mark on this stationary, I don't know what target or in this lake, and he knew that they were useless. Everyone knew that the TBD was obsolete, and so John Waldron, Lem Massey, are telling their squadron aviators, and including the gunners, the day before, we're going to lose about half of us on the first wave. Now imagine hearing that. Half of us are going to be shot down. Now they were all shot down in the case of Torpedo 8, and the others just had a few survivors in each squadron. But nonetheless, that they went. But they knew, all those guys. Okay, this is we don't have much of a chance. But it's all the Americans had, and so Spruance felt that okay, we got to launch everything we got at the earliest opportunity. That's what he told Browning. I do not believe Halsey would have sent the torpedo planes then.
So that is news to me. I completely believe you. You're an authority on the subject, and that's fascinating to me. Just the loss that didn't have to be the leadership exemplified by those torpedo squadron leaders knowing these things, and as you said, it was a known factor. American torpedoes in general, let alone the TBD to deliver it, the known faults. But in the course, they come in, and I think in a little bit we'll talk about the conventional wisdom that grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s around this battle, and then the as you said, masterful work in Shattered Sword. But the conventional wisdom holds. I'm not saying it's wrong. We'll talk about that the torpedo planes then draw the Japanese cap away from the high altitude, so the Dauntlesses can come in. And regardless of how you look at it, they play a part in the battle, right? They come in, and so what's your view on that? Is it they drew the cap down, they kept the Japanese carriers from really efficiently rearming for the strike? What was their part?
I think all the above. I mean, Waldron got there an hour before McCluskey and Leslie did, and he was pounced on by everything the Japanese had. But now that those airplanes are they shot all their bullets and they're low on fuel, and maybe they need to be recovered, maybe not. Something has to happen. I mean, the Japanese had just recovered their morning strike at Midway when Waldron showed up, and then 30 minutes later, Gene Lindsay from Enterprise and BT-6 they show up. So the Japanese are launching cap. They're launching and recovering cap all during this time. In the hangar bays, they're downloading, uploading airplanes. Quick change artists. One Japanese officer said, and then at about the time that McCluskey and Leslie show up, Lem Massey in BT-3, escorted by Jimmy Thatch in BF-3, also show up. So those guys are in their runs at the same time. The dive bombers are falling on the Japanese ship. So that kind of worked out. Now, as far as the Japanese cap, yes, they were out of Schlitz at that point. I mean, they're shooting all their bullets, and they're downing torpedo planes, and they're low on gas. Now, what do they fear the most? A torpedo plane, a torpedo, inside of your ship. That's going to ruin your day. The dive bombers, dive bombers are bad, but we got to get the torpedo planes. So here's these fat dumb torpedo planes plodding along, and it's just easy. How could you resist that? And say, okay, I'm just going to ignore those guys down there. I want to look above me and say, no, you're going to roll right in and start shooting. And that's exactly what happened.
Right. And, worth mentioning, this is well before angled decks on carriers. So while they are launching and landing cap all morning, they're not doing it simultaneously in the way we think of it now. It's a very binary either or proposition at any given moment for a single carrier. So the torpedo planes, the Midway planes, they are continuing to put stress, fog of war on Nagumo and on his staff.
You bet. And now all during this time, a Japanese float plane had finally found the American task force, and this is about 8:30 in the morning. So they get the word back from Tominaga. We got to hit Midway again. Okay, so let's download and upload. So they're about halfway through that. Hey, there's an American carrier here. What? And then in my book, I mean, I just imagine the volcanic anger, frustration on Akagi's bridge. We needed to know this 30 minutes ago. And okay, so all right, quick, okay, steam toward them. Our day of glory is going to come fast. There wasn't so much fear, but this just doesn't look good. We're better than this. So
right.
Let's all go and sink them now.
We're getting a 9.5 from the East German judge on this one, not a 10 across the board. That's what they're thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. And so so that is also what is happening. So that they know the Americans are there, and then just like the Midway strikes, here comes Waldron, so that they see Waldron, and Waldron attack the carrier Soryu on the edge of their screen. So Akagi is watching all this, and all right, so there's a torpedo squadron from that American carrier. Makes sense. And then here comes another one. And they had no idea.
So the Japanese plan does not come to fruition. They are able to launch a strike that afternoon, and we can maybe talk about that in a slightly abbreviated form. Though I will say, maybe not too abbreviated, because I thought you did a marvelous job of describing the experience of the Japanese aircrew and really bringing home. You chose to write about an observer is, in my mind, a main character in a Japanese Kate attack plane, not a Zero pilot, not an attack plane pilot, not a dive bomber crew, but the Kate observer, and it really drove home the importance of that weapon to the Japanese, and just as you said, the attitude of we've got this, we've got this, right? This is going to be nothing but net, and then just the growing frustration leading to despair. But they do launch an attack. They launch two separate attacks against TF-16 and 17. Of course, they don't know which they're hitting. They're trying to get both, and in fact, they both find TF-17. And then why don't you give us the rundown on what happened then?
There's a scene in the movie Midway from 1976, and you probably remember the scene. This is after the American dive bombers have set fire to three carriers, and Japanese aviators on the carrier here, they run to the deck edge and look into the south at three just black palls of smoke, and they can't believe their eyes. You remember that scene?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and so
vividly.
So their Admiral Tamaguchi is just yelling, "I'm getting the airplanes, go." He's not asking for permission. He's taking initiative. Just go. Mm-hmm. And so here within 20 minutes, launches her strike. And there's in my research, they were able to even follow one of the American stragglers, smoking, half dead. And they come across Yorktown, and with their dive bombers. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of bombs hit Yorktown. One hits her uptakes, knocks out her boilers, snuffs them out. So she's dead in the water. Very famous picture of her smoking, heavily from the stack. Within an hour, damage control efforts put Yorktown back together. And so now she's steaming under 5 knots, but she's steaming. She's still hurt pretty bad. The torpedo planes that had been on the morning strike, the Nakajima torpedo planes, that they are now loaded with torpedoes, and the dive bombers come back to hear you. The torpedo planes take off, and yes, this is a strike where I have Taisuke Maruyama, who is the observer. Now, you might ask, how did I choose Maruyama? And Maruyama, as all of the characters in the Silver Waterfall, were real men who lived and fought in the battle. And Maruyama, I learned about him doing my research at the National Naval Aviation Museum. There had been the Naval Aviation Symposium of 1998 had a Midway panel that had Richard Best, Lloyd Childers, Admiral Leonard, and Maruyama. And so he has an interpreter next to him. So he's in his 70s now, and talking about what was going on, and so he obviously survived. And so in my research, I found that he had been on the Pearl Harbor raid, and he was on the morning raid and the afternoon raid from Hiryu at Midway. So I want to concentrate on him. His pilot and gunner also survived the war.
Fairly incredible, actually, given the losses the Japanese took for all that crew. Right.
But just doing research on the B5N, and let's see if I've got it right here. You go into a hobby shop and you can pick up a book like this.
Mm-hmm.
So and here's one for the SBD that I have. So you kind of get a flavor for the airplane, and in here there's some combat stories of aircrew, and
Mm-hmm.
Maruyama's in it. Partial and Tully and Shattered Sword to have all the aircrew from those strikes in there. So I was able to use that.
Again, we keep coming back to Shattered Sword, but I think if you want, let's put two books together. I'll say you have to read, if you want to talk about the Battle of Midway, the Silver Waterfall and Shattered Sword. So I will say that. So the second strike, the torpedo or attack plane strike on Yorktown. First of all, they find Yorktown. They don't even realize it's the carrier that was struck because the damage control efforts have put her in such good shape relatively, as you said, still badly damaged, still very broken from Coral Sea, not at top fighting form when she starts the battle, hit by the dive bombers, Herculean damage control efforts. I think if there's any one thing no one can argue about in the Second World War in the Pacific is that American damage control was second to none, just a phenomenal capability. But so they roll in and I believe they try a classic anvil, even with a small group, correct?
Yes, they did.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it was Lieutenant Tomonaga who had led the morning strike, and so he gets in his airplane, and their policy is, that's your airplane, and where is our policy? Okay, whatever airplane is working doesn't matter. Just the pilot get in a good airplane, but he says I'm going to take mine because it had been holed, so didn't have a full bag of gas, as we would say. But Tomonaga said, I'm taking it. So he knew it was a one-way mission. He led his formation on Yorktown, and now Yorktown's running away. So it's kind of a stern chase, and he's coming up Yorktown's starboard quarter, whereas Maruyama's flight, kind of swings wide to the east, and they're going to come in and attack Yorktown on the port side. So lots of evidence that shows that Tomonaga was shot down by none other than Jimmy Thatch, who had just taken off from Yorktown, turned hard to the right, cranking up his gear the whole time, and there he is, and he charges his guns and shoots them down within minutes of taking off.
Right, which correct me if I'm wrong, he's literally cranking up his gear in a Wildcat. Right, he is literally hand cranking up his gear while taking off, while charging his guns, while looking around the sky. Where are they? Got him. I mean,
exactly. I believe, and the historians are going to correct me here, I think it was 27 cranks to get the gear up in. And so another pilot that I concentrated on in the book is Johnny Adams. And so, he's doing the same thing, taking off. He goes, once he takes off, he's cranking his gear up. He's going to his left, the Yorktown's port side, where he sees the Maruyama formation is now in their run. Mm-hmm. And so he picks one of those. Maruyama was behind the B5N that Johnny Adams shot down right next to Yorktown. right in the middle of the American screen. Everyone's shooting,
Right.
in every which direction. I'm sure many American gunners to see an airplane. I don't care. It's an airplane.
Right.
Shoot at.
Shoot at it. Right.
So that's what Thatch and Adams and the rest of them were flying in that afternoon.
And then the Yorktown is hit again. This
Two
time by
torpedoes, the last
two
two, and
torpedoes.
Mariama's one of them.
Right. And she's holed and she's hurt badly, but she's still alive. And so we can. Why don't we start to wrap the course of the battle here and just say that, of course, the strike group with Mariama, pardon my pronunciation there, returns to Hiryu, but Hiryu's time is up as well.
Yes, as the Americans were returning from damaging, essentially sinking 3 carriers from the morning raid, Yorktown finally sent her scouts out and found Hiryu. And so this information is radioed back. Now Yorktown is hit, and so Yorktown stragglers now find refuge on Enterprise and Hornet. And so on Enterprise, in the book, again, none of this is made up. They gather in the ready room, and Earl Gallagher is briefing them all. Okay, they're about 120 miles away. We're going to go out at this altitude, and this is what we're going to do. So that afternoon, Enterprise first, followed by Hornet about 30 minutes later, and they're again no coordination, poor coordination, stovepipe. The Enterprise planes and Yorktowners in among them. They attack Hiryu and put 4 bombs in the bow and open it up. The famous picture, Hiryu floated through the night after it was abandoned, and you see the upper and lower hangar bay and also the forward island forward elevator, blown against the island. The Hornet airplanes show up 30 minutes later. Hiryu is on fire, so they ignore it and they roll in on the Japanese cruiser Tone. They miss, so Hornet just had an awful day. But what a lot of people don't realize about the battle is that it went on for 2 more days. And there was the Marines on the morning of June 5th attacking a couple of Japanese cruisers. They thought they were battleships, but they were cruisers that had collided the previous night, so they're kind of limping back to the west. And then the American carrier planes on the 5th and primarily the 6th that were able to sink one of them, Makuma, and the other one just barely made it back to Japan. So, but on June 6th, Yorktown continued to float, and so they sent a tug from Pearl Harbor, and we can salvage this thing. But Japanese submarine got in among the American screen and put a torpedo in Yorktown's starboard bilge, right at the turn of the bilge, and this torpedo doomed her. Amazingly, she floated through the night. But on June 7th, rolled over on her port side and sank 18,000 feet. So this is a scene that I have Lloyd Childers, who was one of the VT-3 gunners, grievously wounded, had been rescued by the destroyer Monahan. And so he was in this scene watching his ship sinking, not knowing if his brother was safe, because his brother was on the ship as well.
I know there's a love-hate relationship between they weren't SWOs at the time, but surface crews and aviators. But we're all sailors, we're all naval officers, enlisted sailors, and there's a bond to the ship. So I can only imagine. I think you brought it out really well as he just looked out and the emotion. I wrote my mother when I was a child worked in an office, and I understood it to some point at the time, but not completely. One of her coworkers had been on the Lexington at Coral Sea. And I remember him telling me as a young boy, his experience of, just the tears streaming down his face as the Lexington sank. And it's such an emotional thing. Made a little bit of fun of a friend years and years ago because we went on a mobile training team. And as we went by Puget Sound, one of his ships was there in mothballs. And this was a guy who, I personally can have no filter at sometimes. I think most Navy guys are that way. And my friend made me look like a choir boy, and he starts tearing up. And of course, I've given him a bad time. And my first ship is on the decommissioning block for next year. That alone has me a little bit choked up. I can't imagine what it's going to be like to see her decommed. I don't even want to think about what it must have been like to see your ship sunk, see her go to the bottom
Yeah,
after
we
after such a fight to save her. That's the thing. Like you could, I mean, not to take anything away from the Japanese, right? But it's bad luck at the end, right? If this, a World War II submarine doesn't have the capabilities of a modern, nuclear sub with a homing torpedo, a couple degrees change in course over that preceding 24 hours maybe makes all the difference,
mhm.
and she survives. The other thing, of course, is as bad as our torpedoes are, the American torpedoes, the Japanese torpedoes are just so good because the first one hits the destroyer Hammond, was it?
Yes,
That was alongside
yeah,
Yorktown, breaks her back. Like just she sinks in a matter of minutes. And, but as you said, that's enough to doom the Yorktown, even though she hung on for another 12, 18 hours. So just a heartbreaking battle to lose there on a personal level for that ship.
yes. We believe that our ships are living things.
That's right. That's yeah. There's a bond there that I don't think non sailors can really understand. So that being said, and thank you for bringing up it goes on for 2 more days, right? A lot of people say June 4th, 1942. No, it's a 3-day battle. It has a decisive impact on the war, and uh, you know we took about an hour, but that's I think a fascinating recap of the battle. But let's talk now about research over time, because of course as you move to write the book you're basing it on research, and there was a conventional wisdom about this battle, and we've alluded to some of it already, but a lot of it comes from Commander Fuchida, who is one of the primary, if not the only Japanese source that gets a lot of we'd call it press today, American press, and his works are translated. In fact, I think the Naval Institute Press basically wrote his story in a book called Midway. And so he gave, as you said, a view from his perspective.
And and here it is, my dog-eared copy of
Yes.
Fushida and Okayama's book Midway, and this is a book that they see, Fushida was tasked at the end of the battle to put together an after-action report. And so Fushida obviously survived World War II, and that after-action report he kept with him. And maybe he had plans for it, but in the early 1950s, he was able to publish Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, and got very popular reading in Japan. American translators were able to translate it, and I believe it was 1955 that it was put on sale in the West. Um, and but yes, so Fushida was used as a source from by Walter Lord, Gordon Prang, great historians that have told the story of Midway. And how can you think that what he's not saying is true? I mean, he's the air group commander. He's in the flagship. He's right next to Nagumo and Genda. He knows exactly what's going on. How could you say that he's through again our heroes Partial and Tully, they had gone to Japan. They had looked at the evidence, the logbooks. Akagi's logbook survived, um, and other sources. And the Akagi did not have a strike group warming up on the deck as the ship's turning into the wind. I mean, Richard Best himself, as he's diving on Akagi, he sees 3 fighters, and one of them starts to take off roll, and he thought, hey, if I'm a hero, I can kind of aileron around and shoot that guy, but he concentrated on his delivery. Um, this gets into the fog of war. This gets into the primary sources that are wrong, and eyewitness accounts that are human, and some of them are correlate to the actual written history, and so what is a primary source, and is it a human recollection? Some would say it is, and this is where we get into some of the controversies about the battle.
Right. Because as you said, a primary source, at least when I went through and got my training at the Army Staff College, and my got my degree, primary sources were not to be trusted unless corroborated, and they were defined as a first-person account. But then I think where, as naval officers, naval personnel, sailors, there's I know where do you fit a deck log into that account, right? Because it's sort of a first-person account, but not really. And I think I would give a deck log a lot more credence than a first-person account, and that was that was brought home to me, and that's a story for another time. In my master's thesis, and my mentor, who it was all about a totally different subject, but just how unreliable, even with good intentions and a belief that they are telling the truth, a first-person account can be.
Yes. In my career in naval aviation, I cut my teeth in the early '80s, and so you come back. Did you hit the target? Yeah, I hit it. And so at the end of my career, we had very reliable tape systems, and so if we didn't bring back pictures, it didn't happen. Now so now in 1942 they had cameras, and they in some cases they didn't turn them on. In other cases, pictures were lost to time, sadly. But I'll give you an example. So here's the USS Enterprise after action report, June 1942, and it has an account from the commanding officer of Bombing Squadron 6, Lieutenant Best, how he went over to Akagi, and 3 for 3. All right. Here's the official U.S. Marine Corps history that says VMSB 241 attacked the Japanese on the morning of June 4th, and had 2 hits on a battleship, and that didn't happen. Lieutenant Dan Iverson, in his account, and sadly he lost his life later in the war, but in his account, he was attacking a carrier, and he did attack a carrier, but not the one he thought. He thought he attacked the carrier Akagi, and I guess they corroborated this with the Akagi's captain, and that's not true. But this is, and so, but again, I went to the official U.S. Marine Corps website, and that is their official story of what happened at Midway. Years ago, I was in Washington. I was at a Battle of Midway commemoration. I was sitting next to, one of my battle group admirals from yesteryear, and a high-ranking Marine Corps officer was given the keynote speech on the battle, and it talked about it was bad for the Americans, but the Marines came through and got hits. And my jaw dropped, and I kind of nudged my admiral friend, and he said, "Just keep quiet." But the official history is not what really happened. And so this is where historians they had different takes on what happened. With my background in carrier aviation, I brought that to play also as I wrote it.
Sure. So I think important to point out, I think sometimes there is some institutional pride that goes in on both sides, the Japanese, the American, to writing these things. There's also, just as you said, human nature. And there's also the fact that if you've never done it, things seem really easy, but they're really, really hard. So for example, and I'll let you attest to this one, because I'm not an aviator. I was a ship driver, but determining if that splash was from your airplane, if it actually hit the ship, or if that splash is a bomb from your airplane, if it hit the ship, is that smoke from the ship because somebody hit it, or because they're piling on the heat to get the boilers turning because they want just a little more speed to get out of harm's way? This isn't malicious deception on anyone's part. It's why history's hard. It's why after action reports are hard.
Right, and in the case of Lieutenant Iverson, you're getting shot all over the place, and
right, yeah, there's that.
You can feel the bullets that are ripping through your airplane and turning it into Swiss cheese. So there were 200 bullet holes when he got back to Midway, and his gunner, Private Reed, is cries out he's wounded, and he was wounded in the foot, and so yes, I mean all this is going on. You're and you kind of glance at a ship. Okay, I see smoke and flame. It's kind of what you want to see, but you're still just trying to get out of there. There's smoke everywhere. The water's churned up in front of you, and Sure. We can only imagine.
If if you've never been in a situation to see effects of weapons on target, I'll try a probably very poor analogy, but everyone's probably experienced looking at a word, and our minds are wired to read what we expect to see if you're reading really quickly, right? The shape of the word, the sequence of the letters, and very often you'll see the little tricks, which are, hey, did you notice the second and in that sentence, or did you notice that word really wasn't the word you expected? We're hardwired to see what we expect to see. So if your doctrine and training tells you you've dropped a bomb and you've done your delivery well and it's going to hit the target, then when you see that splash and that smoke, it's natural to think, I hit the target.
Sure. And you're just
Yeah.
you're clawing your way out of there. You kind of look over your
Right.
shoulder, you see just for a nanosecond an image, and then you're not going to look at that anymore because you got plenty of work in front of you to deal with.
Right.
Another,
Right.
you know, John Waldron took
Mhm.
his squadron away from the air group.
Right.
And what direction did he turn? Now that's a whole nother controversy, but this is where two human beings who were in the formation have two different answers that are essentially 90 degrees off. Ensign Clay Fisher, who was Air Group Commander Stanhope Ring's wingman. So Clay
Wingman.
Fisher, I spent time with him in the Silver Waterfall, and he swore to his dying day that Waldron took his squadron off to the right.
Mhm.
And Charles Woodson, who was a gunner in one of those airplanes in the Hornet Air Group. And I don't know if Woodson was facing forward or facing aft at the time, but he swears that they turned left. So they're both watching the same thing. They both have credibility. I mean, they're air crew,
Right.
and they see two totally different things. I mean, you and I could witness a traffic accident, and we would have an account.
Mhm.
But if there was a patrolman there observing the same accident, he would probably have a different account than you and I. I'm not sure if you're law enforcement trained, but I'm not. I think a law enforcement officer would see things that the public
Yeah.
does not.
Absolutely.
And it's all the same thing.
Right. And I think, it's important to remember that when Waldron makes that turn, it's not the turn upon which this big moment in history that people will discuss 75 years later is going to hinge. It's just a moment. It's a turn. Hey, what's he doing? He's not following the air group commander. Left or right is a pretty minor thought in that person's mind as he's worried about, I'm a passenger in this plane. I'm a gunner, but essentially I'm a passenger in this plane. Do we have enough gas to get home? What's going to happen? I'm still fully expecting to find the Japanese fleet and get in a fight for my life. That turn is a really minor thing. And again, human nature is once you perceive it, or once it's like, which way did it turn? Okay, turn left. Every time you think he turned left, it solidifies it. It chisels it into your brain a little bit more that he turned left. So, all these questions and all these things build over the years, and then we get to Shattered Sword.
Yes.
And yes, please tell us about Shattered Sword, which I think is probably as close as we're going to get, unless there's an afterlife where we get to ask all these questions and have omnipotence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shattered Sword. I mean, I was already a Midway geek when it came out in 2005, and wow, it just blew everyone away. I mean, just look at the level of research. Look at this. These guys, they know doctrine. They're talking doctrine,
Right.
And they're writing it as they're career naval officers. Just a outstanding job. But yes, we talked about the best attack, and then there another controversy is which way did the Hornet Air Group really go?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Midway historians are divided, and I'd say maybe 60-40 that the Hornet Group flew a heading of 265 when they were supposed to fly 240. That's what Wade McCluskey did. That's what he was told to do by Captain Murray, who was told by Admiral Spruance. So one can imagine that Spruance, through blinking light, is blinking the Hornet 240, and through a long process, this theory now comes out. No, they really went 265. The Hornet guys did, and why did they do that? Well, I guess Captain Mitcher in Hornet, Captain Mitcher, said, no, I don't trust the flagship. I think that we only have 2 carriers sighted, and they said they're 4, so I'll bet the 2 are behind. And not only that, I'll bet they're about 75 to 85 miles behind on this arc.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're to believe. And so we're also to believe that an Annapolis trained officer who had already selected for admiral, he gets the orders. No, we're not going to do that.
Right. It's not a light decision.
So there is circumstantial evidence. There's primary sources, human primary sources. There's not much in the way of in writing, but there's this controversy, and so where do I fall on this? Mm-hmm. And I'm of the idea that the camp, the belief that Ring flew down 240 behind McCluskey, that was ahead of him, 20 minutes or so. Just like McCluskey, he gets to the end of his leg and there's nothing there, just like McCluskey. But during this time, Ring's squadrons had all abandoned him.
Right.
And now they can, so, here's some evidence. They can look to their left, to the south, and they see a big black pall. That's probably Midway. And there's photographic evidence that the Japanese blew up the fuel farm, so a big black pall of black smoke. Okay. But if you subscribe to the 265 theory, then, okay, what that really was, that says the Japanese anti-aircraft over the Kido Butai making that so that's what they saw. Now, if that's the case, wouldn't they glom right onto that and go, okay, there's anti-aircraft flashes going off, there they are, let's go there. Mm-hmm. So, the story breaks down. And so there's this thing called Battle of Midway Roundtable, where all us geeks hang out. And so for years, the feeling at the roundtable was, okay, this will not be determined until, as you said, we all meet in heaven. And but a couple of years ago, they came out with a definitive position. No, we have primary sources, even though we have primary sources that say they turned right. But we have primary sources, and we have these accounts. And so we're going to say right now that Ring and Hornet went 265, and that they covered it up, and no one spilled the beans over the past 80 years. That's the official position, and I disagree with it. So,
yeah, that again, as a non-aviator, but just seems awkward to me. Not your position, but it seems awkward that Ring would just disregard that. Right. As you said, the Annapolis trained naval officer, aviator is just going to go, yeah, okay, I know the admiral said that. However, right. That doesn't fit.
In my view, this this is similar to Copernicus in the Middle Ages had a theory that the Earth revolves around the sun, and the Catholic Church in Rome that controlled everything in those days. Their position was, okay, that's a hypothesis. Okay, I mean they didn't condemn him. Until Galileo came out about 100 years later and says, yeah, Copernicus was right. There was still no definitive proof then. And so that's when the church said, okay, Galileo, we believe it's a hypothesis. We do not believe it is true yet until you can prove it to us, and you have it. So this is my position on this controversy, the so-called flight to nowhere. It can be left. We'll never know until we all meet one.
We'll never know. But it is interesting to look at how the various personalities in that decision were then affected as their careers moved forward, right? And I know, this is, again, we're here to talk about the book, not the battle, and this is why I think this is important. Is you bring this up, and I'll say now, you wrote one of the few books where I was anxious to get to the appendix or to the appendices and say, because of course, when I get a book, I flip through it. What's here? Where's this? Where's this going to be? And at the back, you have the what happened to them afterwards. And it is sort of fascinating for students in the Navy. And if you maybe shall we say the gritty underside of being naval officers, how things like this, even in time of war, will affect your career. And I think it did. It did and it didn't for people, right? Ring, Mitcher, Best, several other players, Spruance, right? Fletcher. How does all this play out?
Yes, we're human. We're flawed. We have pride, disobedience, arrogance, and so one of the things in Midway that I tackled is the shouting match between Wade McCluskey and Miles Browning on the afternoon of June 5th. And what had happened is Wade McCluskey comes back to Enterprise, and he had been shot in the arm. I mean, he's wounded. He's bleeding. He's going up to the bridge to report what had happened. So Wade McCluskey's in sickbay. And Earl Gallagher, the other SBD squadron CO, he had wrenched his back on the afternoon raid. So now the guys that are commanding Enterprise's airplanes are the Yorktown guys, Short and Shumway. So they Miles that night they had gotten word that there was a fifth Japanese carrier. Again, this didn't happen, but that's what they thought. And so we had moved east during the night that Browning didn't want to do, but hey, there's a fifth carrier, so we got to attack it. And they're about 225 miles away, right at the edge. So let's put 1,000-pound bombs on our airplanes so we can end the war. And so the Yorktowners go to Wade McCluskey and say, sir, we don't know how you do business around here, but this is going to run us out of gas. We can't do this. So McCluskey in his bathrobe goes up to the flag bridge with these guys, and he enlists the support of Captain Murray. And he has it out. Now, history does not talk about how this shouting match went down. So using my background, and I can imagine, being in that situation, I wrote it. But history does record what Spruance did at the end, and he heard both sides. Then he turned to McCluskey and the Yorktowners. I will do what you pilots want. And again, the historical record is that Browning just could not believe that he had been humiliated this way, in front of these junior officers. And he just stormed out and he sulked in his cabin for hours. Yes, human childishness was also part of this battle. Now, what happened to Wade McCluskey? So McCluskey goes on and he commands a light carrier, an escort carrier at the end of the war. Good for him. And then he, ends up in Glenview, Illinois, kind of a backwater command, and retires as a captain, promoted to admiral, tombstone promotion they had in those days. Stanhope Ring, who did not cover himself with glory at that battle, he also commands an escort carrier. Then he commands a carrier boxer. He makes flag carrier group command. Why is that? And Mark Horan, who is an historian that with Robert Crespin wrote a glorious page in our history, his theory is that McCluskey went up there that afternoon and talked back to power. And that, I'm certain, was relayed to Halsey by Browning, that impertinent McCluskey, I'm going to get that guy. And he came up here and did this and just humiliated me and the whole staff. And McCluskey didn't make flag. When McCluskey did what he was told, he changed he got the two carriers. That was his assignment, and made one of the most important decisions of the war. It changed the course of the war, and he should have been.
But that moment of impertinence,
but
right? A little bit of color or seasoning, if you will. I'm picturing him coming up in his bathrobe, and I don't think it has the cultural impact now. But if for people who have ever watched MASH, it may not have the impact of Hawkeye Pierce walking around in his bathrobe, but that was sort of a big deal, would have been a big deal in Vietnam, would have been a big deal in Korea.
Flag bridge.
Right. I mean, 50 years later.
His arm is bandaged.
Right. 50 years later, not the flag bridge, not an aircraft carrier, not an admiral. You don't go onto the bridge of my cruiser unless you're in wash khakis.
Sure.
Like if an engineer had to come up, it better be a good reason he's not changed out of his blue poopy suit. Because back then it's like, you're either wearing khakis and dungarees or dirty work. Like that's the 1990s. You don't do that, right? I can only imagine 50 years earlier showing up in your bathrobe with a wounded arm to tell the chief of staff no.
Yes. Yeah, we're not gonna do it. Another part of my research. I mean, typical anal retentive aviator. You got to research everything. I learned that Spruance adopted the practice of Halsey's men that during a battle they didn't shave. And so you think these are straight laced naval officers. You're going to shave every day of your life. I mean, what kind of an officer are you? I mean, what kind of a gentleman are you? But during the battle, it must have been something for a guy like him, maybe for the first time and since he was a teenager, not to shave.
I think for Spruance, who of course did cover himself in glory and went on to great things, the study and leadership there is phenomenal, right? To understand what he does know, understand what he doesn't know, and to make, launch, send them now, right? Send the dive bombers now, launch at the first possible moment. He's not an aviator, but he sees in the moments the decisive action that needs to be taken. Yet when faced with McCluskey a day later, he realizes this is not my wheelhouse. Pardon the bad analogy there, but this is not my wheelhouse. I'm going to do what you aviators tell me is best.
And another vignette about Spruance that I loved writing about is the following day on June 6th, where the two Japanese cruisers and the Americans are beating them up. And so there are 3 TBDs left on Enterprise that are flyable. And so McCluskey goes to Lieutenant J.G. Bob Lobb, who had survived the morning of June 4th. Says, can you fly him? Says, yes, sir, we can. So they bring Lobb up to Spruance, and Spruance in front of the strike group, which is Shumway and Short, says, if there is even one gun flying, if there is even one gun firing, you are not to go in there and attack the ships. Do you understand? Not one gun. And I'm sure that young Lieutenant J.G. will have, yes, sir. And everyone said, okay, okay, Admiral, you got it. Not if there's anything firing, we're not going to send them in. And so, a human, caring,
right?
Yes, there's more important things than that.
That's right.
The lives of you 6 young men are more important
That's right.
than putting that ship on the bottom.
And understanding in that moment that there's something hugely important for those guys, right? For those 6 men, it's for the torpedo squadrons to go in and get a hit.
Yes.
We've lost all these guys. And there's something, I don't know, maybe you get it from sports. I know you get it in the military, which is make your brother's sacrifice not be in vain, right? Like don't let the side down, as I think the English would say, and go do that. You guys are not going to make a difference. You 6 guys, you 3 planes are not going to make a difference right now physically in this battle. But spiritually, psychologically, morally, you can make all the difference. And there's nothing more important than that except your lives. Because I'm not going to throw your lives away. Yeah. That is an emotional peak here in what we're talking about. Let's use that to pivot, because you bring that out. It's something that I don't see in a lot of other literature. I don't see as poignantly anywhere. So let's talk about writing that. Let's talk about rolling back for a second. I think everyone can understand your passion for the Battle of Midway. So it seems like maybe this was a no-brainer, right? What are you going to write about? Well, you have a passion for it. Midway geek, I think, is the term you use, and I'll say that with respect. And we have some listener questions, and I think we're going to answer them as we go through a lot of them. And why choose the Battle of Midway? I think by now, having listened to this so far, that's pretty obvious why the Battle of Midway. But what
Yes.
made you want to tell the story
The
in
Killer
the
Angels by Michael
lens of
Shaw.
historical fiction in the first place?
Fascinating telling of Gettysburg, and you can read many books about Gettysburg and narrative nonfiction and antiseptic analysis of the battle. You can go to Gettysburg, but Shara brought it to life, and I wanted to do that with Midway, and Midway is an epic battle that deserves it, and it's been done before, but it has not been done by an aviator who did not change any facts of the battle. Other aviators like me had written novels, historical fiction novels about Midway, and they might start with a fictional fighter pilot who is running around Honolulu, and then hey, we're shipping out, we're gonna, but and then there are others. Barrett Tillman, who is a fine author, a naval aviation historian, wrote historical fiction about the battle some 30 years ago. It's quite good, but he had some fictional characters in it. But he didn't have my professional background, and so I wanted to do it that way. I started right in. It was 2 days before the battle. Many books they said, okay, Pearl Harbor, Doolittle Raid, Coral Sea, and now here we are. But I just go right into it, just like Shara did. Just go right into the battle, and then how it was fought, and the human story. And I think that the human story is something that I like to write about in all of my fiction. In my Raven One series, there is an antagonist that wherever the enemy is, and I like to make him a person, a human person with human feelings. We think of the enemy as inhuman, but we all are, and so with all of our human flaws and dreams and everything else. So that's what I wanted to do, and these young men that fought in June of 1942, they had everything to live for. But as we talked earlier, they went. The torpedo guys, especially, they knew what they were facing, and they went anyway. And so just to tell that loss, and what it must have been like, the terror. You're in your TBD, and all of your wingmen are being shot down next to you. Just what was that like? So that's how I approached it.
So then that leads to several other listener questions of the process of how you do that. And I'll lead into this question, staying with the torpedo bombers, using the letter, right, that starts the book. How do you tell the story of someone who's not here anymore? And I think that's hugely important, because so many of the other accounts are antiseptic to some degree, because the people who died are the most compelling stories, and suddenly we have this voice from beyond the grave.
Yes.
How do you go about doing that specifically for those participants, but also for the guys who lived and wrote memoirs? They're not around, and they're not writing in the way that you're writing their experiences. What's the nuts and bolts process?
I'm really glad to receive this question. We're talking about Ensign Bill Evans, who was the youngest pilot aboard Hornet. And he was in BT-8 that fateful day, and he left such a record of his writing. He kept a diary, and so wow, what a loss! What an outstanding writer he was for only 23 years old. And so it was easy to kind of tell the VT-8 part of the story, through his eyes. Easier to me than, say, George Gay, who survived. I thought but Bill Evans lost his life, and I needed to be very circumspect with how am I going to write about this, and does Bill Evans have any ancestors alive? And so I was writing this novel and putting it together in 2019, and I contacted Robert Morasek, who wrote Dawn Like Thunder, an outstanding story of VT-8. And so I contacted him and said, are you in touch with Bill Evans' ancestors? And he said that he was. And I think there was a brother who would be in his late 80s, 90s. and so he gave me his address in Indianapolis, and I reached out and I did not hear back, but I wanted to reach out to him and say, sir, I want to write this story and your late brother relative, and treat it with the honor and respect he deserves, and I seek your blessing. Uh, so I wrote that. I did not receive a response, but I can I know that I treated Bill Evans and his demise that I wrote about in the novel with as much respect as I could.
I feel that you did. It's never an easy thing to talk about, right? And we have much more recent and contemporary, and probably in both of our cases, personal losses in that line, and just by the nature of our work we did. And I think that if you had been writing about one of my friends, I would have been content, maybe is the right word, with the portrayal. Happy's not right, or but content. Like you did him justice. So with that, you have his writings, which, as you said, fortunately, a very exquisite writer. Maybe that's the right word. So you could sort of start to get inside the mind. You have the writings about Browning and Spruance and so on and so forth. And so I imagine you pull those down, you start to get a flavor for who they were. How do you go back and start writing about what it felt like on that bridge, or what it felt like in that cockpit? Because one thing that strikes me, you go to a maritime museum now, you go to one of the battleship parks, and I can walk onto a battleship, a destroyer. 80% of it feels like the ships I drove in the 90s and the 2000s. Cockpits don't feel that way anymore. And I start reading the Silver Waterfall, and there's a moment I distinctly remember feeling like I'm sitting here in this birdcage type, I know that's a Corsair term, this birdcage canopy in, what is a machine that is state of the art at the time, but looking back from where I am now, it's anything but state of the art. I've got a vague idea of where I'm going. I don't know if I'm going to have enough gas. How do you put someone so vividly in that seat? What do you do as an author?
At the National Naval Aviation Museum, there is an SBD Dauntless, and this is the Dauntless that was flown by First Lieutenant Dan Iverson at the Battle of Midway. This is the one, and you've seen this picture. It has 200 bullet holes in it. The story how it got there is another story, but I sat in that cockpit, and I sat in the rear gunner's cockpit as well, and so to kind of get a sense of, okay, here's what he was looking at. Here's the handle that releases a bomb. Here's the handle for the dive brakes. All of that. You can kind of get a sense of what he's seeing off his left and right wing. But there are books, and here's another one. Good old hobby shop have books like these about the SBD Dauntless, and there's all kinds of stuff out there, and there's stuff at the National Naval Aviation Museum. I had a pen pal years ago he was a World War II SB-2C Helldiver pilot, and he had flown the Dauntless in his training, and so he sent me some research, and we had conversations about how you're tell me about the deck run, tell me about how did you roll in, and he told me that in the SBD the gunner wheeled around, faced forward, and is now calling out altitudes, and this is confirmed by Mark Horan, historian Mark Horan. So you're calling out altitudes 6,000, 5,000, 4,000, 39, 38, 37, and all the way down to about 2,000 feet where the pilot is going to pickle and now pull. We talked about G's. We talked about there's no G suit. There's no shoulder harness. There's just a lap belt in the airplane. So all of these, I could get a flavor then for flying this airplane. And again, my memories of being high over an open ocean, and all you can see is water and clouds. Vivid memories. The memory of, okay, here's the setting sun. I've got an hour to go. It's going to be dark. Don't want to do this. So that is how I was able to do it.
Um, as I look through so some of the questions now start to pivot away from the actual writing of the book to your feelings on, as a historian, as to what did happen afterwards, what might have happened afterwards. So let's start with one or two of what did happen, and we touched on this a little bit. And this is a very loaded question. It's a very judgment based question, but was history fair to Stan Hopering?
I think so. I think so. That um, we've seen officers like him. We've seen them like McCluskey, and everything in the middle. And so, yeah, he retired as a 2-star, the Tombstone promotion to 3. But there's plenty of evidence that he was not a good leader, and his air group didn't like him because he mistreated them. Back in the beach in Hawaii, didn't respect his ability as an aviator, and a squadron commanding officer told him off on strike common frequency and just took his squadron away. The fighters just turned around, didn't even tell him, they just turned around. Ruff Johnson takes his bombing squadron toward Midway, didn't even ask for permission, so they didn't have respect for him. But he had his sea daddies, if you will, and he obviously, went on. He may have had a bad month in what was a stellar career, but that's when he was tested.
That's right. You don't get to choose when that test comes.
Yeah, and there, but for the grace of God.
Right, exactly.
All of us can do that, but I do think that history has judged him. And Miles Browning is another guy that a lot of people don't have very much nice to say about him. He was a tough guy. He was a selfish guy, and just pushed people around. But he was given command of the USS Hornet, which is a museum in Alameda, California today. So a great carrier. That's a plum job.
Yeah.
And but was found negligent in the deaths of 2 sailors, and so he was done.
Right. And we talked a little bit, I think, to answer this next question about Spruance and why he was successful as a cruiser sailor commanding this carrier task force. And I think I'll let you answer this one, but obviously it wasn't just Midway. He showed a flair that led him, to be on par with Halsey for the rest of the war. I mean, Task Force 77 essentially divided between that. It was, am I right, is 77 at one point and 75 on another, depending on who commanded it.
Or 77 or 57.
Thank you. Yes, 77 and 57.
Back. There's the Third Fleet and Fifth Fleet, but
yes, thank you. Yeah.
But yes, Spruance was cool and calm, whereas Halsey was let's charge, take the flag, follow me, and you could say to a fault for both men. So here's Spruance 2 years later, and at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had already occurred, and so Mitzer now is going to his boss, hey, okay, we shot down hundreds of airplanes yesterday. How many can they have? Let me take my guys west and sink these guys. No, I want you to keep your carriers near Saipan. You never know, and we're supposed to be defending Saipan. So then the next day, all right, they're there. Now we have the mission Beyond Darkness, very long range. We get there right before the sun sets. Now we got to fly back, and it's dark when we get home. And this is where Mitzer famously said, turn on the lights. But still many airplanes were lost, and did they need to be? Another example of Spruance who was not childish, maybe like Yamamoto, caring about his ego. In 1945, Mitzer's airplanes come across Yamato, and so they're ready to sink it. But he asked, but it'd really be something if Spruance did. If Spruance, were to engage Yamato with his, Spruance has 10 battleships against Yamato, and but Mitzer said, look, I'm here right now with airplanes, and Spruance said, yeah, go ahead. Whereas he could have been the Jellicoe, he could have been George Dewey, and with this great surface action. But he said, "No, go ahead. The most efficient way, just do it now." At the surrender in September of 1945, Nimitz kept Spruance away because, and I write about this because who knows what could happen if we all get blown up. At least we'll have Ray Spruance.
Right. The lone survivor concept. Right.
Yeah.
With the State of the Union address is okay. If this all goes bad, who do I want out there? And I want to say something about his decision to let Mitscher's planes take Yamato. Is we are 4 years after the demise of the battleship as a major weapon. It's still at that point is a sore point, and Spruance comes from that surface Navy. There's not just personal glory for Spruance here. There's an opportunity to say, guess what? We are still the big dog or a major player. My whole area of the service is still just as relevant as the aircraft carrier, and he puts the mission first.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the writing was on the wall. I mean,
right. Oh, absolutely. But I think we've seen human nature.
That's right.
How long did the military struggle with a Cold War mentality through, a counterinsurgency war? Not to go off track, but it's hard to deviate from what you know. And so I think, I would agree with you that he was just a remarkable individual. And, to Halsey's credit, and as you said, they were sort of polar opposites of one another. One almost has to wonder, if we swap their places, in a couple of key battles, to use a phrase, the world wonders, right? What might have happened. And in both cases, it turned out okay. But Halsey had a genius of saying who's the right guy at the right time at Midway as well, and that was Spruance.
Yes.
All right. Since we're in that vein of the future, let me send a couple of questions out from listeners. If Midway had been successful from the Japanese point of view, is there a realistic thought in the Japanese mind to take the Hawaiian Islands, in your opinion, and could they have done it?
There was no realistic thought to take Hawaii, and they could not have done it. I mean, Hawaii now has 100,000 soldiers. I mean, on December 7th, it had 50,000. You're not going to do an amphibious landing in Hawaii. It's too far away. The supply line, no. What Japan wanted to do was to knock out the United States Navy as a threat to the Western Pacific. There was never an idea, and this was the hysteria of the war. Oh my gosh, we're going to land in California and march to Washington. That was
not going to happen. The whole philosophy of the Japanese being, we take the Western Pacific, we make it so bloody and so costly for the Americans that they give up before they reach the home islands. And Midway, as you pointed out earlier in the interview, was not even about Midway Island. Midway Island was just bait.
Yes.
It speaks to how decisive, how can an action be decisive indirectly? And if the Doolittle raid isn't staged, does Yamamoto not get the okay for the Battle of Midway, and how differently does the war go? Because the Battle of Midway only happens because of, as you said, the general acknowledgement, the home islands, the Emperor is not safe because of carriers. How do we draw out the American fleet?
And so, please forgive me, Scott. That's a question. If we don't go to Midway, how do we get the Americans?
Mm-hmm. Well, no, that was more of a statement, and I think, and leading into the next listener question, which if things go differently, then do the Japanese take the Solomons? They took a portion of the Solomons, but do things not pivot at Guadalcanal then later that year? And does that change the outcome in New Guinea? I know we're getting far afield from the Battle of Midway, but because it's pivotal,
sure.
These are the questions.
Had we lost at Midway, Would Japan land on Midway, and then would they be able to sustain? Only 1,100 miles from Hawaii, because we still had some naval forces.
Right.
But impartial until they talk about this, and we know instinctively the arsenal of democracy Japan and Germany had no answer for. We would
Right.
have won World War II in 1946 or 47.
Right.
And we would have. But what the victory at Midway did really is help Roosevelt and Churchill with the Germany first policy.
Mm-hmm.
Japan is now kind of neutral. And we still
Right.
took the fight to the Japanese 2 months later in the Solomons. But, okay, Japan is kind of neutral right now. So now we can, put the resources that we need to into the European theater. And this is where former SecDef James Schlesinger, at a speech at the Army Navy Club in Washington, I was witness to this speech. He talked about, what if we had lost? And, would we have been able to land in North Africa in November of 1942? And probably not, because the American people were upset at Japan and
Right.
wanted to get back to the Japanese. But now the Japanese are making it hard for us. And so that Japan is our mortal enemy. And if we weren't in North Africa then, maybe the Germans could have held on at Stalingrad. If they
Right.
weren't fighting us, they would have had, the Luftwaffe would have had enough
Mm-hmm.
forces, and it was a close run thing, but they didn't. And now, so Stalin is now moving across Eastern and then into Central Europe. And if we had not been there at D-Day in
Mm-hmm.
June of 1944, what would have stopped Stalin from just keep going through the Low Countries in France? So this is his
Right.
theory, and it's a fascinating theory.
Mm-hmm.
And that the world would be quite different.
So we're now, sort of delving into another area of my research, and I tend to agree with that analysis. And there are arguments all over the place about what can the Soviet Union actually do without Lend-Lease and without our mobilization. But I think that point is spot on. That you watch these dominoes fall of Midway allowing us to bring pressure in North Africa, which puts pressure on Germany, which allows the Soviet Union to move forward. If we don't do all those things, I think even today, right? Are we seeing a war in Ukraine today? I don't think it's too much of a stretch for me to say if we don't win Midway, does the Cold War happen the way it did play out? Does the Soviet Union have the majority or all of Europe? And if they do, is there enough change that we don't see a war in Ukraine today? That is that far-reaching, that pivotal of a battle, I think.
Maybe. I mean, Stalin would have gone as far as we would have let him. And if, we met him in central Germany, and then we all divided Germany up as we did. But, yeah, he would have kept on going. He certainly would have taken all of Germany without question. And if Holland and Belgium are available, Denmark and France is they've got nothing. So yeah, why not?
All right. Well, that actually are just the way we had that conversation hit the remainder of the listener questions, I believe. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your time. This has been a magnificent conversation. Please tell the listener again where they can find more Kevin Miller and what Kevin Miller has to offer already and what's in store in the future.
Sure. Well, my website, kevinmillerauthor.com, but you can find me on Amazon, and 4 novels on Amazon, the Raven One trilogy, and the Silver Waterfall, a novel of the Battle of Midway. I am working on another Flip Wilson Raven One book. This will be number 4, and I'm going to make him an admiral. And we're gonna find trouble in the North Atlantic with you know who. My followers have been hearing this for years, but I have started it, and anyway, just keep pestering me. I'll get it done.
Good things to those who wait. And is there a Raven One campaign for DCS I've heard about?
Yes, there are 2 campaigns in Digital Combat Simulator based on Raven One. There's Raven One and there's Raven One Dominant Fury, and with Baltic Dragon and Jello Aiello, I'm partnering with them, and we're working on a third campaign right now for release probably next year.
All right, excellent. Well, you can find links to Kevin's site and to his Amazon site on the Authentic website, and those links will be in the show notes below. Kevin, again, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Hey, Scott, enjoyed it. All the best to you and Authentic Media.
Thank you so much.